So welcome everyone. We are very happy to have the hybrid launch of the environmental justice, the thematic issue of Critical Romani Studies, online and here in Vienna at CU. My name is Marton Rövid and I'm the acting chair of the Romani Studies program and one of the managing editors of the Critical Romani Studies journal. I will just say a few words about the journal for those of you who don't know it. It's an international peer-reviewed open access journal which seeks to provide forum for activist scholars to critically examine racial oppressions and different forms of social exclusion and human rights abuses of Roma. It's open access journal and it's accessible also for authors. It is published by the Romani Studies program, so not a for-profit publisher. That's why we invite each of you to submit us articles, and you will have the opportunity to publish it without a so-called open access fee, which is very commonly asked by publishers. This issue has grown out of a conference that we organized 2 years ago, which was titled Racism, Justice, Environment, Critical Approaches in Romani Studies and Beyond, which we co-organized with the Environmental Social Justice Action Research Group of Central European University, the Roma program of FXB Center at Harvard University, the Critical Romani Studies Department at Surrey University, and the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. It's a very thick issue, it's open access, and in Vienna you have also printed copies. It's 14 articles by 20 authors, and it was, as you can see, it was basically 2 years of work. It was, we have the two distinguished editors are here with us, Jekaterina Dunajova and Marek Szilvási, and we have at least 3 of the authors with us, Jutka Baris, Sergen Gül, and online Beatrice Lindström, and maybe other authors will join online as well. So I would, without further ado, I would invite the editors to introduce this issue.
Thank you, Marton. Good afternoon, everyone. I first would like to start to say thank you to the organizers, to the Romani Studies department here at the Central European University for inviting us and for hosting the journal as well. As has been said, it took a bit of a journey to produce this special issue dedicated to environmental justice topic. We're very happy with my colleague. I let her speak just in a second to launch this issue and to present a little bit about our intentions, why this thematic focus, and then we would like to, without further ado, give space to the authors because I think that's the most substantive work that has been done on that journal. Yeah, I would pass them.
Yes, so I'll second everything that Marek has said. And I also want to thank the authors for bearing with us through the many rounds of reviews and improving their papers. So I wanted to say a few words about the importance of the topic and why we think it's a milestone that within Critical Romani Studies Journal and in general, we're talking more about environmental justice. And why, in particular for the Roma communities, environmental justice is a form of justice that needs to be discussed, that needs to be problematized, and that needs to be more brought to the forefront of the agenda for policymakers and not only academics. So with this belief, we edited the special issue, which is an attempt to address Romani communities and the environmental injustices that they face. Those of you who looked at the issue already online, you see that there are a very broad spectrum of topics that is being covered. And what we also argued in our introduction is that despite growing awareness that environmental justice, environmental injustice is being faced by marginalized communities like the Roma, nevertheless, we see that it continues to be overlooked in various policy documents and still an issue that needs to be unpacked more in academic discourse as well. So what you'll see in the special issue is a linking of environmental justice to broader social inequalities. We try to understand the complexities of environmental justice, issues of environmental justice, and rather really than going through what some of the the articles are covering, because as Marek has said, we want to give space and room to the authors to talk about it. I just wanted to briefly show that we wanted to be inclusive with the knowledge that was produced in general during the conference that was held 2 years ago. So what you'll see in the special issues is not only these classic academic articles, the peer-reviewed academic articles that cover many cases from Turkey, Slovakia, Romania, North Macedonia, and beyond that. We also included 2 book reviews, and we included case studies that are more practical, showing lived experience and do not necessarily have to conform to the strict academic rules. Nevertheless, we thought that all of the case studies, which also went through editorial reviews, covered very important areas of environmental justice, and also were showing some of the realities of how environmental justice manifests in some of these regions and areas. And then we have a section on special contributions, which we think is a very unique part of the special issue. One is this visual, and I'm calling it a counter narrative, because when you look at it, it is really talking about a story, or again, lived experience from a different kind of perspective than what we're used to. And the other one is reflections from a conference that was held relatively recently, and it's more of a critique of where environmental justice is going, and really showing some of the ways in which environmental justice can be unfolding, both in terms of academic discourse and also policy.
Yeah, thank you. So I would just like to add a very couple of points that I think are important in this context. So as has been said, this special issue is focusing on the distribution on environmental hazards and harms along the ethnicity divides in Europe. And like most of the articles are in some form articulating how Roma are being relegated often to environmentally hazardous areas with limited access to public infrastructure. It's the overall line of the issue is an argument that the environmental problems of developed industrial societies often rest on the shoulders of those individuals who are the most vulnerable, and race and ethnicity and class as well play a part in these lives in toxic waste and flood zones without access to clean drinking water. There are a few important things which I think would like to highlight, is that environmental justice or environmental racism movement, or environmental movements in general in Europe, were not initially sensitive to social inequalities and discrimination, but this has been changing in the last 2 decades. It's a very important point, and I would like to highlight here that it has very much to do with the Roma movement and Roma rights movement in Europe, because most of the initial cases that the movement refers to are somehow related to Roma. So just to mention 3 examples, there's been what we found out as the very first case of environmental justice advocacy in Germany in 1985, concerned an eviction of Roma in the city of Darmstadt to a toxic waste, and that's the environmental movement in Germany refers to this as a birth, or as a genesis of that movement in Germany. There was also the very first case on access to drinking water and discrimination at the European Court of Human Rights that concerned Roma. It was the case against Slovenia. Unfortunately, that case has not been concluded positively. But again, the whole movement for right to water, or access to water, and the legal battle in that space has been inspired by Roma movement, or has been intertwined with the Roma movement. And perhaps the last example is that the EU policy framework that is sensitive to environmental justice is relatively new. It's been really the last couple of years that there is a EU framework and policy, and that has also very much grown from the EU Roma policy making. The very first referencing on environmental justice discourse within the EU policy space came from the Roma frameworks, and has been introduced to broader setups. So I think that's an important to highlight. The other element that is important to highlight, and we try to make an argument, is that it is Eastern Europe that has the worst pollution records, especially when it comes to coal plant pollution, air pollutions, and it's usually Roma communities that are relegated or forced to live closest to those sites of pollution. So many of articles are making the argument on this kind of proximity to toxic sites, and that there's no other options for many of the Roma communities just to live in those environmental hazardous spaces. I don't want to end up on the negative note. As I was trying to say, there's also we try to argue like that there's an opening for Roma movement to join forces with the broader environmental groups, environmental justice groups as well. And it's been really happening in the last couple of years that this two or several thematic groups has been working in collaboration, and I think like that's an important point to highlight. I would stop here. I would pass to Martin again, and with the order of the authors. And
I think we agreed that Sergen, you would start, right? And you try to find your PowerPoint. This one. Yeah, if you want, you can stay there because we don't have the camera. You can use this. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to say a couple of things about the LGBT program, which opens the door for me to understand what is environmental justice. And before that, I studied my master in chemistry. I didn't know that how to touch my community with my knowledge. And I will, especially thanks to all of my teachers in the LGBT program. And also want to say about what is environmental justice. Our editors already mentioned. It is a quite new topic, I would say, because it started in 1918 in the USA.
Can you speak a bit, Sergen?
It started in 1980s in the USA. And the first environmental justice studies focusing on the Roma community was published by the Richards, who was doing the PhD at CU. This is critically important. The time was the 2006, as far as I remember correctly. And then the Tamara Stager did a lot of put a lot of efforts for raising the awareness of the environmental inequalities faced by the Roma in EU. They publish also books and several articles. What I'm telling this is a quite new topic, but we have been seeing all of the results of the environmental inequalities and degradations from the Roma settlements. It has been centers, every time you can see, but this is just a new movement that we should say something about before starting. I have quite long title. I didn't make it shorter, and let me try to read it. Industrialization in modern Turkey and search for environmental justice for the Romani population of Dergen and River Basin. Romani voice in environmental segregation. This was my LGBT thesis, and then I turned to articles. And I just want to also thank to the organizing community. It's a great event, and also very happy to share my study. Before starting, I would also briefly mention that environmental injustice, which are quite related to the social inequalities, discrimination, marginalization, neoliberalism, capitalism, and systematical discrimination, which is quite related with the institutional racism. We cannot separate them between environmental justice and the social justice. It is the dynamics of the period. And here is my study area. It's you can see in the left-hand side and the Ergene Basin. This basin was named by the Ergene River. It's covered almost all of the place of the basin. And this is very unique water body of the basin. And it can be used so many purposes, such as irrigation. And this place belongs to the western part of Turkey. It's a part of the Marmara region, and where the Roma are mostly populated and live there. And and my presentation, it's gonna start with the discriminatory laws, starting from Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, how the Roma were marginalized, discriminated, and what was the dynamics create environmental injustice in this region. I will briefly mention it. In Ottoman Empire, Roma were labeled as outsiders, difficult to control groups, and they were along with the spice, and also there have been so many discriminatory laws related to Roma. We can see in the draft of the law, draft of the Asher and Muhajirin, and the Roma were together with the anarchists, spies, and beggars and gambers, and some period of the Ottoman Empire they wouldn't allow to enter the borders of the Ottoman, and also they were subject to higher taxes. Even most of them are Muslim, they had to pay a lot of taxes, and this shows like some of the discrimination patterns related to Ottoman period. And when the Ottoman period finished, the Turkish Republic was founded, and religious understanding was abandoned, and the Turkishness movement was started. Everyone living in Turkey at that time described as a Turk expect Roma. We can see in the settlement law, we can call them as a settlement law, I would say. In this law, Roma were described as a group not affiliated to Turkish culture. And there are so many dynamics at that period. First of all, I would like to mention the agricultural revolution of Turkey, because newly established Turkey wants to create agricultural revolution to rise its economic development. Then at the same time, in 1924, another important movement was happened, which is population exchange period, was between the Greece and Turkey. Most of the Roma came from the Greece. They were settled mainly the agricultural basins of Turkey. You can see in the right side of the map, the most populated area is the Ergene Basin. The reason was to produce rice production here, because this is very critical place. It's right now the supplies more than 60% of the rice production of Turkey. And when it comes to 1930s, there has been some assimilation policy towards the Roma, and one of it, like Roma must be distributed to Turkish villages to be assimilated, and also they were along with again the same groups that I mentioned before. It shows that how the patterns of the discrimination coming from the Ottoman period to Turkish Republic, and even the regime of the country changed, but the patterns is same. And in 1956, this is very important, Roma were described as a potential criminal if they don't have any jobs. And this creates a lot of problem accessing to public sector jobs, because before accepting the public sector job, there is also the investigation, security investigation there, government searching you, something like that. But in this law, most of the Roma couldn't attend the public jobs. We're gonna see in our case studies. Industrialization policy, it's very important body of my article. It's mainly started in 1930s, following the agricultural revolution of Turkey, building the sugar factories, but it has been showed the peak in 1990s, where the the polluted industry migrate from the third world of countries. And Ergene Basin was play very important role. More than 3,000 factories were built in this region without having any waste treatment system. And they discharge their industrial waste into the river. Sometimes the rivers flows red, as you can see, sometimes blue. And it also creates a lot of environmental issues like soil contamination, food insecurity, reducing the biodiversity, and also cancer risks. Because I saw in one report, which was published by the CHP, main opposition party of Turkey, says that 90% of its habitat in cancer risk. And heavy metal pollution also was found in human bodies, soils, groundwaters, every place, you know. And the first generation of the environmental justice studies focus on how pollution affect the people. But the second generation one, as I mentioned, how react the marginalized community to the environmental degradation? What was the process of the historical marginalization that create this? That's why my aim was how the Roma will react to the industrialization and modernization policy of Turkey in this polluted basin. To understand this, I use the biographic narrative analysis and collect. It is important to collect memory, experience, and narratives of the local peoples. And also, I use the environmental justice framework and some of the theory of the environmental justice scholars. I have to be rush, I know. And let's start with the narratives of the people that I met during my study. Actually, the participant A was a 16-year-old man, and he was doing the agricultural works in this basin. And his family also came from the Greece. And in the very initial step of our interviews, he said that people wrote Coptic and migrant in their identity card when they come to Turkey. And this is showing that most of the Roma are coming from the Greece at that period. They were marginalized by the government, and also they were denied to the citizenship rights. And also he said that I want to be soldier in the army, but I changed my settlement. This is also showing the 1956 law that I mentioned before. And another important thing is that how was it, before polluted the river? I asked the question, and he said that when I was young, it was clean. I can swim in the river. I could also fish in the river. Even I could drink water from the river. But now it's not possible. Even I cross the bridge of the river, I have to cover on my nose. This shows also how the beauty of the past has been transformed to the synthetic pollution of the today. I was shocked when he was said that I wish this river had been polluted 100 years ago, because I didn't understand. Before, I was thinking that there is a pollution and there were some reactions of it. But he tried to explain this moment. In the Ergene Basin, the Roma were seen as a labor force in agricultural land, and they discriminated in a different way. And now the river polluted, and we started to migrate to industrial cities and find better life, like learn the health insurance, retirement, and something like that. And there are so many riverbeds. There are so many settlements in the riverbeds. Also, as you can see, the Ergene River connects with the Meriç River, which is also another river of the basin. I talked with the two riverbeds people. They are living in these riverbeds. And Meriç one, who was the political science, Roma researcher, he said that Roma don't have any right or any opportunity to escape from the environmental degradation. They have to drink this water polluted by the Ergene River. They have to cook with this water because they don't have any chance to escape from this environmental degradation. And also the Ergene riverbeds, one of the interviews was this site, and he said that we are losing our population, becoming unemployment, and because this pollution also decreased the agricultural yield of the product, and they also it also led to unemployment. I checked the population data of the town. I saw that it has been decreased 18% in 70 years, which is more than 1% in a year. And I am approaching the end. Pollution gain also identity in this region, because the political science experts say that if you ask the Gajo, who are non-Roma, where the Roma settlement is, that they will definitely say that they are living in the polluted river. Another important thing is that just a year ago, I was in this settlement. I saw the flood is coming through the settlements. And I took this picture, and this is important because the government built the social houses for Roma under the flood risk area. And this is also showing the lack of the recognition of the issue. And I ask myself, is it possible to escape from the environmental injustice? Is it migration is a solution? Following the Beck's argument, because Beck's argued that pollution follows the poor. I approached someone who already migrated to industrial city from this settlement, and he was saying that we are suffering from the air pollution here, because you can see in the red polygon, the settlement is quite near to the industrial zone. And we can argue that people living in the Ergene riverbeds, they mostly suffer from the water pollution. When they migrate in this industrial city, they also suffer from the air pollution. Environmental justice is just changing and continuing. And coming to end, Roma people see themselves as the victims of the environmental discrimination, which is a legacy of the social discrimination. We can see that in Ergene Basin, environmental harms and benefits are not equally distributed. And also another things are the lack of the recognition, participation, and also income balance is another problems. Thanks for your attention. I don't know, maybe I took a little bit of time.
Thank you for this very important paper and presentation, Sergen. Maybe we can move on. And then we will have time, of course, to ask questions, make comments, both in Vienna and online. So thank you again for the paper and presentation. Judith, please present your article, and I will find your PowerPoint.
Thank you. I will really wait for the presentation because there is a picture at the beginning, and you can see what I'm going to talk about. Because I will introduce only one case, but there are several cases which, based on, we can really argue that there is very hard to say, like, realizing that environmental justice in Hungary and probably in Europe as well. And the case which I will introduce, it happened around 1 year ago, and there is still no solution for the people who live there. And before I introducing the concrete case, I would really speak about some difficulties which really made the organizations, even the environmentalists and the social movement, difficult to highlight the issue first, and also to provide some solution. The first difficulties regarding to Hungary, I'm saying that since 2016, the Hungarian government using the crisis situation to allow the government to decide without the intervention of the communities and intervention of the municipalities and intervention of the citizens. So they call it a kind of crisis situation, but based on different reasons. They started in 2016. They call it because of the mass immigration. After they used the pandemic emergency for this one, after they used the Ukraine-Russian war and associated with the emergency, the energy emergency. So they always use, they always find the reason to exclude the democratic process to assess for decision making. And this really influenced the decision on environmental investment, which are really damaging environment or probably going to damage environment. So they can get licenses without any intervention of the citizens. And it's also related to the Aarhus Convention, but I will speak about shortly later. So, and also the Orban government introduced a kind of regulation on the national interest, which is above the population fundamental rights. And it's mean that any of the investment which is happening in near to municipalities or within municipalities, and the local people are not agree on, the government can intervene, and there is a special agency which is called National Interest Agency, National Interest Investment Agency, can intervene and take out the decision from the hand of the municipalities and the local citizens. That's why we could have a lot of batteries, factories without any, even the people are protesting because they don't have a say to stop it. And also, which really made hard the work of the environmentalists and the social movement, that there is no any units within the governmental structure which we can turn to because of the environmental compliance in any cases. So many years ago, we had the kind of environmental authorities, but not anymore. And there is no any places in the governmental sector which we can say that this is dedicated for receiving compliance from citizens or from any people who, or NGOs, let's say, who want to complain any environmental damages. And what I would say also a barriering to work with environmental justice, that the permit regulations, which investments are getting before the licenses, the permit regulations are not covering the distance from residential houses. They only measuring the noise of any agricultural or industrial investment in industrial sites. And you will see that what is the relation with the wretch case, because people live 200 meters from the stone mine places, so 200 meters from the houses. And happening in Hungary, that more and more cases, the industrial and the inhabited areas are overlapping. And because of the regulations I was talking before, people cannot stop it. And also, when damage is happening, those who are created the damage, they are denying their responsibilities because the authorities are back them instead of backing those who are the victims of the damage. And you will see the wretch case exactly showing how it's happening. And I would say that politicians brave to be publicly against the compensation of any cases which is compensate Roma victims. They are speaking publicly, and they can present in the press as well their opinion about this one. Aarhus Convention is not localized, and so the basic, that's, I don't know how you are familiar with the Aarhus Convention. The Aarhus Convention is the only convention regarding to environment which obliged by, can be forced by law. And many of, for example, Hungarian environmental law is based on the Aarhus Convention, but it started in 93. So that time was very, very progressive, but not anymore, because from that time it didn't change so much. And the three basic pillars is access to information regarding to environment, influence the decision regarding to environment, and also access to justice when happening something which you need to restore or need to stop. And these three things are not fulfilled regarding to the wretch case as well. Wretch is the name of the settlement I will speak about. And also, there is not enough cases brought to the court, so the lawyers and the judges are not so much familiar with these cases. So there is not enough case to learn how to decide on this and how to understand these issues. And also Also, there is no fund for minorities to run litigations because these are years sometimes, and there is not enough fund and no access to funds for long years litigations. And also communities and local Roma organizations or other CBOs are not so much familiar with the environmental issues, or they are not on the agenda, the environmental justice knowledge and any of the tools which can help to really build this movement. So what I would say from my experience that the environmental movement and the social justice movement are not so much interrelated, and they not cooperating enough, and they don't know each other's knowledge and don't share so much. And about the Rechk case, in Rechk, you can. No, it's okay right now. In Rechk, it's happened that the municipality and one company, which is really close to the governmental people, one company asked for permission to open a stone mining place near to a settlement, which is called Rechk, and those sites where Roma population live, and almost 13% of the Roma population are Roma, and they mainly live in 2-3 streets, which are 200 and 600 meters far from the new stone mining place. And during the COVID, there was a kind of a situation when the municipality, the mayor, actually could decide instead of the municipality in one-handed, so they don't have to discuss with any of the local citizens. So they decided with the coal mining, they asking for permission, and they got for 40 years for stone mining near to the houses. 40 years. So even the damage happened, they still operating, and they still have the license for decades. And it's happened that the company started the deforestation because for the stone mining, because these are open places, so it's not undermined. This is not underground. These are the surface mining, and they started the operation in a way like they did the deforestation, but for a bigger size of territory, which is allowed by their license. And they didn't move the land which they were cutting up with the street. With the trees, so they kept there, and also some climate changes is happening in a way like those heavy rain happening, which usually not. So people are not ready for this kind of different rainings, and it's happened. And all the mud which was put in the hillside, because of the heavy raining, it's happened to slide into the houses of the people. Because of this 200 meters was enough for the mud to get into the houses, and 70-80 people got without a place to stay. And because it was a big disaster, actually, people had to be evicted from the houses, but nobody gave them accommodation. So they were placed in a stadium of the local place. And actually, it's happened that still some families still couldn't get back to their houses. And the government decided to give them a kind of compensation. They decided to have 500 million forint, but few months later, they just decided to delete this decision and cancel this decision without saying to the people that they will not get the compensation because of the damage of the houses. And there are mining authorities which were investigating the case, and they established a report which was saying exactly that the company was doing the mistake with the wrongdoing deforestation. And in this way, even the authorities reported this one, the company denied their responsibility. And also politicians publicly say that these people are the victim of the raining, and they have the responsibility to restore the houses because they didn't have insurance. So the politicians intervened in publicly, and they were saying that these people not, they don't propose to get the compensation because of the damage. Even the authorities reported differently. So this is the case. And if you analyze what are the frames for not getting any compensation and still not how to say, like, and people are still not aware how to get the justice. Some of the lawyers, they approach the families and they offer them some help, but because there is a lack of how to say, like, there is a lack of frame in the environmental law to sue the municipalities, because nobody is established that, because it's an environmental issue, environmental injustice, nobody established as the even the authorities say that the company is responsible, but the court didn't accept this how to say, like, justification, and the investigation by the police was totally against the report set by the authorities of the mining authorities. So the police investigation told the last sentence about this case, and so they stopped but they can still start the court case. But for this one, they need to have a kind of new how to say, like, new investigation, which they don't have a money for. So I think it's going to have a many years issue for these families. And in generally, I would say that the conclusion for other cases as well, and for the Recs case, is that the Hungarian operation of the state institutional system and the licensing procedure is no longer reflect the fundamental rights of the fundamental rights mentality, since the state would only fulfill its obligation if the environmental justice aspect were to take precedence over other economic and budgetary aspects, and if there were no license that were issued solely in the interest of economic operators. It means shortly that they really in favor of the economic interest instead of the human rights of the people living in any places, because where the investment sites overlap with the inhabitant places. So that's the conclusion for.
Thank you, Jutka. No, it was very, very important that you highlighted this tragic case from Hungary, but thank you for your very important work. And let's move on to Yekaterina Dunayeva. I will find your PPT. Maybe can you grab the microphone, please? Yeah.
I just hold it?
Yeah.
All right. No, I can't. Thanks. Okay, so thank you. I'm going to talk about a paper which is based on a study that I'll introduce in a moment, and the contributor is Diego Marin from the European Environmental Bureau. And this is a paper that will take slow violence as a frame or framework to analyze the situation of Romani recyclers in North Macedonia. Yes, and also to give credit, so the picture, which I chose from another article, which I'm crediting in the next slide, I also want to talk about visual representation in the last slide, so keep this one in mind for now. So the picture is actually from the article that you see on the bottom of this page here, and I wanted to forefront just a few maybe theoretical models that you'll find in the literature about how to think about informal recyclers as part of either circular economy, or if we want to think about it as economy in general. And usually we can distinguish three kind of models: the suppressed value chains model, the hybrid value chains model, and formal value chains model. And now I won't go through all of them, but as you see, the critical difference between these three models is whether and how the informal sector is treated. Whether the informal sector is not recognized at all and even criminalized, that would be the suppressed value chains. And I'll forefront that this is the type of situation that we'll be describing in our case study. And then the other ones, the hybrid value chains or the formal value chains model, they do consider, recognize the informal sector or informal recyclers, and in some instances even integrate them. And this is important because we know that there are models like that, and we know that these models tend to be more humane towards the informal recyclers by formalizing them. So perhaps we don't need to treat them as informal at that point anymore. Nevertheless, in another study on which this academic paper is based on, we reviewed some of the interesting cases. Some of them are actually in Latin America, where the informal recyclers as a sector is treated differently or is recognized for the value that they're providing for recycling in general and the circular economy that the European Union is striving towards. Okay, so about this study. Now, as I said, it is inspired and based on, rather, by a report. It was not an academic study, but it was a report that we co-wrote with Diego Marin, as I mentioned, from the European Environmental Bureau. There was fieldwork that was conducted in 2022 in 5 Roma settlements. I have a table in the article in the Critical Romani Studies journal that describes the sites. I won't do that today. And approximately 50 key informant interviews, unstructured interviews, were taken within these sites. So this was done with a researcher, and then we were able to work with the data. We also used or reviewed some of the data that was uniquely gathered by READY, the Roma Entrepreneurship Development Initiative. This, to my knowledge, is a very comprehensive interviewing of informal recyclers, Roma recyclers in North Macedonia. It was able to interview 512 waste collectors in 15 cities. So they generously shared their data, and this was also included in both the study and the report that it was published. So in terms of the analytical framework, so within the critical environmental justice, we're looking at slow violence in particular and arguing that what we're seeing, the forms of injustice, can be conceptualized as slow violence. So what is slow violence? Well, there is a social dimension of environmental pollution that leads to unequal distribution of environmental health risks and unequal impact of environmental pollution on socially deprived and vulnerable groups. There's also an understanding of violence. What is violence? And usually we see violence as something that occurs within our site, something that we can see, something that we can feel. It's different from slow violence, and now I'm quoting Nixon here that we used heavily in our article. Slow violence is defined as violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. So this is what distinguishes slow violence from, again, the classic violence that we are familiar with. Nevertheless, environmental injustice, in other words, this environmental burden of lack of clean air, lack of clean water, or just environment in which one can safely live, would constitute slow violence according to this definition. In other words, slow violence is out of sight. It is characterized by graduality of contamination and hazards, ambiguity of boundaries of impact, and expansive scale of slow environmental violence. And that is very important because other than it being a slow and gradual type of violence, we also need to understand it as something that has very hardly defined boundaries or borders. And this is what all of the pollution is. It doesn't end specifically anywhere. It is dispersed, and it is very hard to pinpoint sometimes. Overall, this is why we're seeing that slow violence is a framework that can capture the experience of the Roma community. These are the case studies, and again, there's more description of them. These are some of the pictures that were also collected during the field work. And let me briefly walk you through some of the findings. And again, I can't do justice to the paper in 10 minutes, but I just want to highlight a few of them. The interesting paradox, and I think many of the researchers in environmental justice are seeing it, is that waste has become a source of income. And many of the interviewed persons have talked about on their inability to access waste as damaging their income, something that is threatening their livelihoods. Many of the families described that in order to make ends meet, they engaged in waste recycling, and for some, this was the primary source of income. I wanted to highlight also that some of the residents referred to waste picking as family business. So again, they saw their labor as something that is work, as something that should be seen as integral part of, I don't want to call it a capitalist economy, but nevertheless, an economy that is fueling cities and countries. So calling them or categorizing them within this informal sector is not how, for example, many of them have seen their very hard labor. In the report, by the way, by the European Environmental Bureau, we do not use the term informal recycler specifically because we don't want to focus on the informality of their work. We also looked at the consequences of COVID-19, which even more highlighted the reliance on waste and the discrimination that they faced. This is when many lamented that they did not have access to waste, not only because waste was not available, but of course because there were some restrictions on movements. And this also was threatening their survival strategies because, again, their livelihoods were very much connected with accessing waste. And this is another quote. During the pandemic, police officers used to fine us for crossing streets with our carts and were instructing us not to collect bottles from the streets. And this is, again, somebody who is describing their hardships during COVID-19 because they had to collect the bottles in order to make the money for the day. So waste collection is seen as a kind of self-employment and the main source of income for households. And limited access to waste threatened livelihoods of these waste recyclers. The reason I'm saying this is because when looking for potential answers or solutions to the situation of waste recyclers in general, this is something that also needs to be taken into consideration. And this is a paradoxical situation because obviously we all would argue that a clean space and a clean environment is something that everybody would deserve. We also understand that capitalism does create a lot of waste and garbage. And in another study, actually with Joanna Koska from Lancaster University, we argued that waste has now become waste is money. Waste is not only a source of income for the informal sector, but garbage is a form of income for the formal sector. So there's a competition for waste. And so some of the restrictions, and this might not be necessarily the North Macedonian case, but we're seeing in a lot of other places as well, restricting access to waste might be a strategy for the, let's say, formal, those participating in the formal economy to guard their source of income or their waste, because this is something that, of course, they will be using for their business. So this is a complex network in which I would call them capitalist players are also participating, and in which I see, and I would argue that Roma are losing out in many instances and in many spheres. Another finding I'd like to highlight is, again, of course, the multiple levels of, well, I call them challenges, but we can call them marginalization or discrimination that Roma face, and specifically the Roma recyclers face. So it is a socioeconomic marginalization, which of course the non-recycler Roma would face as well. But what this is coupled with more enormously is the health risks, because of course they are exposed to more of the hazardous materials during waste collection. Air pollution, respiratory issues, these were some of the challenges that many of the informants have complained about. Specifically, some of the examples talked about burning wires for metal extraction that creates a lot of the fumes and again, health hazards. So again, the formalized sectors that engages in waste recycling, they would of course have some protective gears, and because they are in the informal sector, there's not much protection that they can have access to. And I just wanted to highlight that this is not a unique standalone case. Both of this article and the report and other articles that we have written in this topic, we've listed numerous regions globally in which studies have shown the same kind of outcome, indicating that informal recyclers are increasingly subject to developing health conditions, including mental health issues, the more time they spend picking waste. And a few words about implications. One is abandonment, especially from the perspective of the state. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, there is the aspect of economic necessity because many of them can make ends meet through recycling. But on the other hand, it is coupled with very serious health hazards and environmental issues. So this economic survival through hazardous work makes Roma rely on waste collection for income, which exposes Roma to long-term health issues. In addition to that, or where the abandonment takes place, is that many of them also complain that when they need medical attention, they do not get medical attention. In the article, I have a few quotes about it too, where families are complaining that in doctors' offices and other medical facilities or even pharmacies, they either don't have access or again experience discrimination. Then the systematic neglect of Roma communities was also seen by failing to provide basic services such as clean environment, waste removal, and safe income alternatives. Given that employment is either scarce or not available for many of them, again, this is why many would choose recycling. Competition from private companies that further limits waste across access for Roma, and this is something that I mentioned already. Again, not only in North Macedonia, we did a comparative study where we used other countries too, and we've seen enormous pressure from the private companies that engage in waste collection to demarcate their territories. And when Roma appeared or came to some of these territories to pick certain types of waste that they can sell, this is when this competition was really seen. So again, these forms of abandonment, we argue, is sustaining slow violence because it allows harmful conditions to persist. So overall, these social, economic, and health vulnerabilities are intertwined, and they also reinforce one another. Environmental policies often overlook Roma and the environmental injustice that they face, and hence they also reinforce slow violence through legal and social exclusion because many of them are either not aware or don't have any legal protection that they can turn to. And finally, and this is a little bit on the framing, this indispensability, and again, we made this argument in other articles as well. So social exclusion, stigmatization of Roma, showing and talking about Roma in relation to garbage or waste is something that further justifies marginalization. It reinforces discrimination. And again, in another study, we collected some of the newspaper examples in which politicians and also newspapers were framing Roma in relation to waste sites and garbage. And this leads to racial expandability, that undervalued racialized groups are deemed as insignificant or even redundant. And I'm using two examples here, and one is from the World Bank and the United Nations. And actually, as you see, the titles are very positive. The United Nations one says praising Roma's contribution in Europe, and nevertheless, I included, and nothing against these organizations, but I included the visuals that they used. And as you see, in both cases, even though there's something that is attempting to be uplifting, trying to focus on the value of Roma to the economy, and to just social development within the region. Nevertheless, the visuals are often either something that is, you see a lot of litter or lack of development in the surrounding areas. And again, going back, and this is the last slide, to the very first one, I actually appreciated this more because it shows a lot of work that went into collecting. And I don't know if you guys collect cans, then you know that this is a lot of work. And also just the weight that is being carried on this picture on somebody's back. They're not using a cart or anything. So this is to highlight that recycling, and in some countries in North Macedonia, we have seen that too, the expertise that actually goes into recycling is something that is to be valued. And also the labor, the very hard physical labor that goes into recycling also shows that sometimes some regions, the amount of recycling that is done by informal sector can be even more than what is done by formal sector. So if in the European Union and the member states, we value and want to promote circular economy and recycling, then we absolutely need to understand that much of the recycling is indeed done by the informal sector. And then this is something that needs to be talked about more seriously, understanding the framework of the environmental justice in the process of, discussing circular economy. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We have an online author, Beatrice Lindstrom, so I would invite you to present briefly your article, please.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much to the editor and editors of the journal, and also wanted to give a shout out to my co-author, Dritan Berisha, who couldn't be with us here today. So our article examines the somewhat notorious case of lead poisoning of Romani communities in Kosovo, and we're looking at this not only as a case study of anti-Roma environmental racism, but also with a focus on what we see as both the opportunities and limitations of legal institutions and human rights law in exposing environmental racism and closing accountability gaps by providing a framework, or at least a potential framework, to assess the responsibility of duty bearers towards marginalized communities. So just to provide a very brief overview of sort of the basic underlying facts, this is a case that dates back to 1999 in the aftermath of the Kosovo War, when about 8,000 Roma had to flee after the Roma Mahala, where they resided, was burned down in an attack where Roma were essentially in the middle of the war between the two sides and were accused by ethnic Albanians as being Serb sympathizers. And so about 600 of the residents of the Roma Mahala in Mitrovica fled to northern Mitrovica, and they resided in camps or sought shelter in camps that were well known to be heavily contaminated with toxic lead. They were set up in close proximity to the Trepča mining smelter, and they release tons of lead every day into the atmosphere with a negative impact on the health of the nearby communities. And that is something that was known by the United Nations at the time. So the UN initially intended for these camps to be open only on a temporary basis out of a recognition that these camps were unfit for human habitation. But in the end, they ended up being operational in one of the camps, in the case of one of the camps, for over a decade. And so during this time, there was severe exposure to lead by the residents who lived in these camps. The camps also, as you can see in this photo, had inhumane living conditions that likely exacerbated the exposure to lead, because it meant that through contaminated water and direct exposure to soil, there was sort of no physical protection for the residents to be able to prevent essentially ingesting the lead into their bodies. The UN mission in Kosovo at the time served as the de facto government of Kosovo. And so not only were they the managers of the camps, but they also were the interim administration who was ultimately responsible for the respect, ensuring the respect and protection of human rights throughout Kosovo. And so despite these really horrific conditions, it wasn't until 2004, so about 5 years after the camps were first opened, when the death of a young Romani girl led to international outrage, that more attention started to be brought to this issue, and yet still the last camp only closed in 2013. So just to say a few words about the legal framework, because the UN was the interim administration, it held unique responsibilities in the context of Kosovo, and it was bound by human rights law throughout its operations. And there are significant implications of that. One is that human rights law, of course, has as a fundamental aspect of it a prohibition against racial discrimination. And it prohibits not only measures that are explicitly discriminatory, but also those that are indirectly discriminatory because of the disproportionate prejudicial effect on a particular group. And so duty bearers like UNMIC are required to pay, quote, sufficient attention to groups and individuals which suffer historical and persistent prejudice to ensure that there is equal access to economic and social rights for all groups. And in the event that the prohibition against racial discrimination is violated, it then in turn triggers a right to an effective remedy that should include compensation for the injuries and ensure guarantees of non-recurrence, among other things. Now, because the UN was the duty bearer in this case, it created particularly high barriers for the Romani communities to access justice in this case. The UN also enjoys widespread, very broad immunities from suit, which means that there's no court that one can turn to seek enforcement of rights when they're violated. And the only place that survivors were able to turn was to the UN's own Office of Legal Affairs that is under obligation to settle claims for personal injury that's suffered by civilians. But as you can see from this kind of crazy chart here, the UN essentially sent the survivors on a wild goose chase back and forth between New York and Pristina. They didn't rule on the claimants' files for about 5 years. And during that time, out of a general recognition that the UN held this very unique role in Kosovo, the UN also decided to establish what's called the Human Rights Advisory Panel. And so this was a somewhat unique body under human rights law that had jurisdiction to determine the UN's own responsibilities for alleged human rights violations. And this is really what forms the focus of our article is the analysis of the opinion that the Human Rights Advisory Panel ultimately issued in 2016. And so over this 10-year period, the claimants were seeking to access compensation both at the UN in New York and in front of the Human Rights Advisory Panel in Pristina. And finally, in 2016, the advisory panel did issue a landmark decision specifically on the lead poisoning case. So they looked at the totality of the evidence and assessed it against UNMIC's human rights obligations. And the aspect of this decision that our article focuses on is the panel's discussion and analysis of racial discrimination. And this is a part of the decision that I think has often been overlooked, both in scholarship, but also in kind of the general narrative around the import of this decision. And so that was part of why we wanted to devote some analysis in the article specifically to looking at how the panel dealt with this allegation. And we think this is important because, of course, over many years, Roma rights activists had long charged that the prolonged placement in the toxic sites and the US decade-long evasion of responsibility was grounded in discrimination and prejudice against Romani communities. And yet these claims were not really embraced in the public narrative around the lead poisoning crisis. And we also think that the UN's kind of reputation as the global beacon of human rights and equality made it particularly resistant to these charges. And so in that context, it became additionally important to have the opportunity of having an independent judicial body assess these claims and come to a determination. And so in this context, the advisory panel, as is now required under human rights law that was applicable in this case, started by examining kind of the prima facie case for racial discrimination or violation of racial discrimination. And in that context, the panel looked specifically at how the Romani communities in this case were treated in relation to other ethnic groups. And so in the context of Kosovo, some of the things they looked at was the fact that authorities had rebuilt nearly all properties that were damaged and destroyed in riots that took place in 2004. They had rebuilt them by 2005. And yet in 2005, 6 years after the Roma Mahala was destroyed, it remained uninhabitable. They also looked at the fact that in another case, UNMIC had relocated ethnic Albanians from a village that was facing an unrelated environmental emergency and offered them compensation to kind of help them get on their feet, which stood in stark contrast to the situation that the Romani communities faced in these camps. And so based on that, the Human Rights Advisory Panel concluded that the plaintiffs had in fact met the burden to establish a prima facie case. And this then shifted the burden to the UN to offer rationales to justify their inaction. And what this ended up doing was actually further exposing the extent of the discriminatory perspectives of the UN itself, in that some of the rationales that they pointed to was attempting to justify this by pointing to the, quote, unhealthy or risky lifestyles of the displaced, or of Romani communities more broadly. The special representative to the Secretary General also pointed to smelting activities of the Romani communities as being a source of the lead exposure, even though there was no scientific evidence establishing that that was in fact the source, when there was also this notorious mine right in the proximity to their camps. And so rather than trying to take action to control the pollution coming from the mine, the sole action UNMIC undertook was to criminalize smelting in the camps as a supposed response to the lead poisoning. And finally, and perhaps most problematically, UNMIC also included among its counter-arguments that Romani communities have historically lived in substandard living conditions, and that because of that, it shouldn't be held responsible for the continuation of those kinds of conditions. Now, the Human Rights Advisory Panel importantly saw through this and concluded that UNMIC's inadequate response to the crisis may have been driven by discriminatory stereotypes over scientific evidence. And it also specifically addressed the point of the kind of historic living conditions as being, quote, discriminatory and debasing, since it suggests that the social and economic marginalization of Roma is based on race and on their own actions, and as such may be perpetuated without responsibility. And so the panel came to the conclusion that this actually imposed an added obligation on authorities to protect their well-being rather than being able to avoid responsibility by pointing to those historical conditions. So our article then goes into analyzing the value of this legal decision, and we conclude that this was quite an important, even if incremental, victory in the struggle for racial justice, in that it recognizes anti-Roma racism as being at the heart of the UN's actions and inactions that led to the violation of human rights. Procedurally, the using the burden shifting in the case also has allowed marginalized communities to overcome evidentiary challenges that are so often really intertwined with the power imbalances inherent in any racial discrimination claims. And we also see the decision as one that is quite important in that it shifts the power between the Romani communities and the UN, kind of recasts it as being not just about kind of the UN as the empowered actor and the Romani communities as the marginalized, but then turns that power relationship into one of duty bearers and rights holders. And finally, of course, also it provides a vital reframing of unmixed conduct as being unlawful. At the same time, though, we're also acutely aware of legal institutions as hegemonic structures that so often reflect the underlying power structures in society that have led to the ongoing marginalization and discrimination of Romani communities. And we see this being reflected in the very structural foundations of the Human Rights Advisory Panel, in the sense that it was, at the end of the day, still an advisory body. And this means that the UN retains the power to determine whether and how it was going to implement the decision. And the result of that has been that now, 9 years since the opinion was issued, there still has not been any reparations for the victims. And all we've seen for it is an empty trust fund that has been established, but that has not received any financing from member states. And so just to conclude, we also spent some time situating this case in the broader jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, which very much has been at the forefront of both not actually adequately dealing with anti-Roma racism, but still making kind of incremental changes towards recognition of the way that especially police brutality cases against Romani communities really is grounded in racial discrimination. And if you're interested in reading more about that, that's contained in our article as well. And I guess just in conclusion, to kind of take my scholarly hat off and put on my advocate hat, I think one of the things that's so striking about this case beyond the legal barriers to justice is also the way that over literally the decades, Romani communities across Europe and around the world have continued to organize on this case in particular. And I will say that we are still hopeful that there can ultimately be justice. And just next week, there's going to be a meeting of different capitals across Europe to address this issue in particular and consider the question of reparations. And so while it's been a very long and drawn out struggle that's really tied up in many of the structural barriers to justice that have been discussed today, we also see a lot of hope and see this as a case that underlines the critical importance of pairing legal strategies with out-of-court strategies and advocacy strategies that maintain the pressure and focus on building power outside of the courts as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice, for this very important work at highlighting this issue. And basically, you can see that these are in-depth presentations and articles. We wanted to highlight a little bit these topics. And maybe just very briefly, I can see that here are with us authors of the infamous case in Cluj-Napoca, Transylvania. So I would invite Enikő Vince just to briefly reflect a bit on the article she wrote with two authors.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Good evening to everyone. I'm here with George Zamfir, one of the co-authors of our article entitled The Struggle for Anti-Racist Environmental and Housing Justice, a view from a militant research project in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. So we agreed that we will have like 5 minutes or so. So therefore, I will not go through the contents of the article, but only emphasize a few characteristics of our approach. So we are referring here to militant research of which we were part of, together with George and Vasile Gâlbea. In addition to our long-term involvement with George in the social housing now movement in Cluj, which actually was triggered in 2010 by a spontaneous revolt against the eviction of 300 Roma people from the city center and their relocation to the landfill in the Patarut area of Cluj. So what we understand by militant research and what we actually practice ever since is acknowledged production, which aims to support political struggles. So also in this article, our main aim was not to contribute to the conceptual, theoretical understanding of environmental and housing justice. However, we also made some conceptual contribution to that too. But yeah, again, our main focus is to offer, and I hope that the readers will find that useful beyond the case of Patarut. So to offer a methodological toolkit for how to address this situation in Patarut, where inadequate housing, toxic environment, health condition under great risk, and also precarious jobs are overlapping. So what we did with this research, which was called, and it was we did it within a project called Just, was to we made this sociological study on the formation of the residential area of Patarut. Actually, this is a long-term militant investigation of ours. We just made some wrapped up of what we already knew about this, and highlight the responsibility of local public policies in this sense, both in the term of environmental policies and housing policies. Second, we used a legislative view on and clarified some the central concepts of our research, which is the right to a healthy environment and the right to adequate housing, concluding that in these situations, in order to reflect what is actually happening, we need to use the combined term of racist, environmental, and housing injustice. Thirdly, we used a medical perspective, so to speak. So we made a medical survey to identify the illnesses that people who are living in Patarut are suffering of. And also we measured the air pollution in the housing area. So, and at the end of the, in the article, we obviously present the results of all these segments of our investigation. And at the end, we assemble this empirical data into we think coherent explanatory framework. Why was this militant research? Again, because we produced this knowledge by the means of these methods to use this knowledge in different actions. And we used it in a court case against institutions which are responsible for the creation of this situation. We used this in the case of a petition that we submitted to the Romanian National Council Against Discrimination. We used these results for raising awareness through a campaign among the larger public inclusion in Romania, about the fact that the situation in Patarât is not only a case of territorial segregation and marginalization, but is also a case in which people's biological life is threatened. So maybe I like very much the term Ekaterina used and elaborated here, so slow violence. So maybe we can also be more radical, saying such cases are actually cases of slow murder. I guess, well, this is a new perspective in treating in Romania these and similar housing and environmental conditions. And well, the final conclusion of ours is because these situations are a result of so many processes, economic, social, political processes. It's not enough to have a better legislation regarding the right to healthy environment and right to adequate housing, but there is a need for social and economic policies which would create the possibility for every people to make use these legal rights. And thirdly, and most importantly, our conclusion is that actually the profit-driven capitalist society and institutional racism are basically responsible for the creation of such situations which dispossess people of the means necessary for a decent and healthy life. Georgia, you would like to add something?
Just to thank the editors for keeping this going. I think it's really important to have all this documented. Unfortunately, it seems like it's going to be more useful for future historians because what's happening at the moment, it's very, very tragic. And I have no good ending for this. I have no expectations. I've been doing this for many years. Most of you have been doing this for more years, and it's all very depressing. We have to rethink how we do things and what's happening and what affects the studies that we do have and how we can get more involved to actually produce change. So things seem very similar in most of the cases that our co-issue authors laid out. So yeah, it seems like it's a bigger process at play, and we need to organize in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for not only your article, but the very important work you are doing. So I think we can learn a lot from the militant research also you are presented. And we are running a bit over time, and these were five very rich presentations, but I would like to still give the opportunity online or here in Vienna to ask questions, make comments. We still have a bit of time. Online, I think there was also some comments, but feel free to join either online or here in the room if anybody has any comments, questions, or to your co-author, you can also ask. I mean, there was one comment online about the detailed map. I don't know if it referred to Sergen's articles or Yutka. Maybe Sergen, I think it was for you how you collected the data for your detailed map. I just saw that somebody asked it online.
Yeah. Actually, I had the two different maps in my presentation. One is about the study area, and there is no any data inside this map. Another one is about the result part, ending of my presentation. It's just highlighting the borders of the Roma settlement, which is near to the industrial zone. And we cannot call it as a data inside the map. It's just the polygon highlighting where the Roma settlement is. And yeah, I hope I'm able to answer this question.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions? Please, Tamar. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry I wasn't here earlier. Missed my own student's presentation. My colleague. But thank you all for this very important journal issue. So I was wondering what. So this is a question for anyone. So we think of environmental, we have this concept of environmental justice, and we have the idea of environmental racism. If you were to capture some important things in terms of thinking about the Roma context, what might be those things? So we know environmental justice has been applied in many contexts all over the world. How would you characterize, if anything, is there anything, that might capture the Roma experience in particular along these lines? Either from a positive approach, resistance, or in terms of the struggles.
Actually, I would invite, if you had, I would be very curious to hear from each of you, because I know your different experiences, but of course it's up to you who wishes to. Yutka, please, yeah.
From my experience, that the basic for being vulnerable for environmental injustice, that Roma people usually live in locations, places which are very low value and very low quality, and actually, or it's valid or valued for different investments and not for habitation. And this is the basic for. And Roma people usually think that their issue is because they are Roma and poor, and they didn't think that there is something with decision making behind and distribution. And also, not CBOs are thinking like this way, and very easy to get year by year to get getting worse their situation because they didn't use the environmental justice framework. But I have to say, like, this is very new in Europe, because we usually speak about housing issues, but we don't speak about property rights and property issues, and it's different. And I think the property rights and property issues are more close to the environmental injustice problems than the housing, because housing is not a basic right in most of the countries. For example, in Hungary, for totally not a basic right. So asking something for housing is different than to make clear something about the property rights, because usually Roma people live in places which are not belong to them, and sometimes the building belong to them, or they live in a place where the building is also not belong to them. And it's not mean these are occupied. It's mean that most of the places are evicted. To this, like the Romanian case, the Hungarian has a lot of Hungarian cases as well. And most of the cases, these places are considered as out of the administratory system of the municipalities. So there is no obligation to provide infrastructure because of holiday places or something, but very low quality places. And in this way, sometimes there is no tools to change the situation. For example, in Yukóbánya in Northeast Hungary, more than 3,000, almost 4,000 people live in a place. We don't know the real numbers, which is really was a former holiday place. And it's like a rainforest in the middle of Europe. And with no infrastructure, even there is no streets names. So people, the post office cannot find the people. And a lot of, a lot of issue is happening just because of this one. The people doesn't have a real address. So they cannot get a job, they cannot get any services because even they have the address card, official, but because of there is no street name, only the number of the place they live, it means that registration number, any of the job places, any of the service providers, even they cannot buy a mobile phone because of this one. So they forced to live on those places which are not on the map of the municipalities in a way like they have any obligation to do some service there. So this is very general, for example, in Hungary for sure, and I think is more general in Romania and the Balkan regions. Because Hungary somehow is more organized in this way, but I think it's not anymore because people are evicted. And most of the cases, people are evicted because of industrial and because of agricultural changes on the places, and authorities are really not considering that cabinets because only also the authorities used to that Roma are not having properties, that Roma are not owning anything. So in this way, there is no thinking about protecting their anything which they own. So I think this is one of the basic for environmental injustice in my country and in my region. And also I lived in a place, Roma settlement, which is surrounded by rivers. And because we couldn't, keep the good environment because we were not owning the place, but the government didn't do any services. So the environment just like shrinking around us. The forest is shrinking around us. The normal part of the lakes are shrinking. So everything is getting worse, and people don't have the rights to keep it clean and better, but the government doesn't provide any service there. So during 20 years, when I was a kid, there was a beautiful environment, and now this is a totally disastrous place.
Any other? Mr.
Yeah. I think the main dynamics of the environmental justice in Roma case, it's romanticization of the environmental degradation. And they are saying that this is the lifestyle of the Roma. They used to live in, environmental risky places. And another one is something related with the power dynamics and political representation. Because we, unfortunately, around the world don't have enough political representation. Also, the academic scholars, it's going to raise this issue. The third one, it will be the anti-Roma racism, or called anti-Gypsyism. It's somehow related to what the Nazis done in the past. Like I just visited Poland, Auschwitz camp a year ago, and I learned that how the Nazi used this propaganda to bring the Roma here, saying that you're gonna have the good job and you're gonna live in a better life. And they put them in the train and send them in the concentration camp. And in this concentration camps, they also use this methodology, Joseph Mengele. All the Roma child in the concentration camp was calling Joseph Mengele as a father, because before doing these experiments on their body, he was giving the chocolate to them. This is also another way of the environmental injustice movement in Turkey as well, in Europe as well. They are saying that we are going to give you something, but they are taking something. For example, in Slukle case, which was the historical 600 years of the Roma settlement in Turkey, they say that you're going to have the good houses. And initially, they just gentrified this, and just all the people forced to eviction in the end. And same with another cases. Also, the slow violence is happening. The process is going very slow. And another one is the movement is also new. Understanding is new. The environmental inequities, and for example, I mentioned before you came here, just also your name as well. As far as I know, the first study is in 2006 about the Roma in Europe. In Turkey, this study is the only study that focuses on Roma community, especially using the environmental justice. And this might be the different patterns or dynamics of the Roma environmental injustice in my understanding.
Katja, Marek, some thoughts on this or?
I've always thought, I don't know if I need to share. Well, on a positive note, I think why this might be a unique case is because of the new push for the Green Deal within the EU. So the question is, do they really mean it, that there needs to be a Green Deal? And if so, then as you know, our study demonstrates, and it is North Macedonia, but again, it doesn't stand out. And in other countries, and actually I had a last slide I didn't even show, and that is actually on Hungary, also looking at the economic benefits that recyclers are also contributing. And there's not too many studies on that because it's informal and it's hard to assess. But because they are emerging, it is clear that they're contributing. We're just not recognizing the contribution. So I think if we really mean the Green Deal and the circular economy, then this would be a way in. And this is where I think Roma, because we're talking about the context of the EU, where the Green Deal is happening, might stand out. And maybe this could be a good example that other regions may follow. But I think there's a lot of conditional sentences here. So whether that will materialize or not, but I think if there's a push for it, and maybe I see our work contributing to that really a little bit, but with some of the knowledge that we can show for why this would be important. And I'm not sure personally how it can be incorporated, and I haven't used the word formalizing because I don't know if that's the way to go, but I do think that recognition can come in many ways, and we need to fully understand what is the best way of recognizing the effort, but I think there's space for it.
And I don't know, historically, so the data that was collected in Sofia, Bulgaria on this some time ago, they were very, very cautious about sharing it because what was happening in Belgrade in Serbia at the time is once they found out how much money was involved in the waste collection, it was then captured, of course, by non-Roma and taken away. So it's such a tricky, tricky space you're in. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Just add something for this one, the electric waste, and also the plastic waste, and also those who are usually happening in cities that people can throw out their waste from the houses. And now the Hungarian regulation is stopping to do it because companies and also centralizing this kind of system, so people from the street cannot be competent, and we cannot compete with the companies. And regarding to the Green Deal, I would say that a lot of solutions which is offered by the Green Deal, it's also creating damage to Roma communities because they don't have access for new energies, renewable energies. Also, those industries and agricultural sectors will be stopped and closed, which they are usually working in because of the low educational status. It's enough to receive them there. And also higher price for food, higher price for public transport. So these people are going to not benefit, but going to be, again, the victims of the proposed solutions of the Green Deal. So we need the Green Deal 2.0, which they think that not the industrial losers should benefit from the compensation, but those who already lost a lot of advantage, having a kind of low emission life and low pollution lifestyle, actually. So I think this should be somehow rediscussed, who should be more benefiting from the circular and the green economic sector as well. And for the social climate fund, Hungary, for example, denied to get this. And I think with the green platform, we have a lot of recommendation for this. Maybe we can share with you. Sorry if I put.
No, absolutely, and I don't think we are over time, but thank you for the question, Tamara. It's an important one. I think like there's many specificities about the Roma case in Europe. I started my presentation saying that how central is the Roma rights discourse for environmental justice discourse in Europe. In most of the cases, or most of the environmental movement has been built around one or another of the Roma cases. So there's a connection between it. I think like with this discussion about the Green Deal's just transition is to be seen how much is this going to actually trickle down to vulnerable communities. I mean, what is in mind even with the environmental social fund? It's really a middle class, more like that should like focus how much this is going to how the European lawmakers and policymakers are going to manage to bring this to that level is to be seen. And yeah, it does not look entirely optimistic at this stage. But I wanted to say there's many specificities, but one is this. I would probably highlight one is this double standards that somehow within Roma remains the case, and the community and peoples who is still okay to be openly discriminatory, even in the cases when you would not necessarily have a discriminatory mind and agency against other communities. That's something like a very specific about these issues. Like that's still like you can design policies, you can implement projects and actions with good in your mind and still harming the Roma community somehow in that space. I mean, there's been just one telling like there's been a new book last year or year before published about the Roma Holocaust and how these two groups of Holocaust activists and Holocaust reminding. But even in the book, like the authors was concluded it was so difficult to find like a solidarity space between the Jewish and Roma activists, because even in the Jewish movement, that it would be the stereotypes will be so strong that it would be forbidding sort of creating solidarities. And I think that's a work to be done to break this unapologetical double standards that the Roma community has to suffer through. And the issue is full of great examples where this is being highlighted, how the Roma communities are being on the short end of receiving environmental harms and not environmental benefits. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists, the audience online here in the room, and most importantly, I hope you will read the articles and join forces, because I know all the precious work that each of you is doing actually beyond the writing articles, I think, which is very closely related to environmental justice. So thank you all, and I suggest that we continue informally. Thank you.
Thank you.